On this episode of the Ask Mike Reinold Show, we talk about altering movement patterns when they're pain-free.
The Ask Mike Reinold Show. Helping people feel better, move better, and perform better.
Before we get to the podcast, I wanted to make sure you knew about my free online course on the Introduction to Performance Therapy and Training. If you want to learn how to get started optimizing and enhancing performance, this is the course for you. Head to MikeReinold.com/performance to sign up today. Welcome back, everybody, to the Ask Mike Reinold Show. I am up at Champion PT and Performance with everybody here answering your questions today. Worst intro out of 300 episodes ever, but you know the drill. It's the 300th episode, you know by now. So what do we have? We have Dan Pope, Lisa Lowe, Dewesh Podell, Lenny Macrina, Kevin Coughlin, Mike Scudetto, and Dave Tilley, all here answering your questions. Anything you want to talk about, head to MikeReinold.com, click on that podcast link, and fill out the form to ask us a question. So we can answer your questions. That's what this podcast is all about. Len, who do we have for a student today?
We have one student. This is a very unusual time in the world of Champion. We have Michael Berra from Belmont University in beautiful Nashville, Tennessee. Michael played Division I baseball, and watching him throw, it's obvious he played Division I baseball. He's good at throwing.
Yeah. So Michael, what do you got the yips? What do you got?
Yeah, I got a case of the yips.
Is it the yips or are you injured right now? Because we've been watching you play catch, and
I think it's definitely the yips.
Is it sad at a standpoint and Champion? So Lenny and I, we made it. We're well into our 40s, especially Lenny. And man, we just kind of stopped playing catch like 2-3 times a day at work, right? Like because our arms are killing us and stuff. So Michael, you got a long way to go, my friend. So so heal up, get that arm going. Let's get that cuff strength going. But anyway, Michael, what do we have for a question today?
Today we got a question about altering pain-free movements. So from Kevin in New York City, he's asking, when would you change someone's pain-free movement pattern? For example, when a knee moves into valgus with a squat.
Man, I would say we get a variation of this question almost every time we record episodes to some extent. And I feel like we've touched on it a bit in the past, but it's kind of like a polarizing topic in here. But yeah, I mean, we deal with this question quite a bit. I like the way Kevin phrased it. And I think that's why we picked your question this time, Kevin, here, is that it was more about, not about like what is good and what's bad, but is when would you change someone's movement pattern that you deem poor or suboptimal when it's a pain-free movement pattern? Who wants to start with this one? Dave?
Yeah, I can think of two things off the top of my head quickly. So one is, I think maybe the argument or the thought process of training into a valgus load, for example, or some sort of movement to strengthen that tissue and capacity to end range has good merit, but I think we have gotten a little bit too far down the rabbit hole on this one. So people are doing jumps into valgus and are doing some things. So the first time, I think in my mind, is when there's an abundance of evidence that maybe suggests that a certain type of position is maybe higher risk, right? And I think ACL tears and dynamic valgus under load is a really good example. There's pretty good evidence that that's a pretty classic mechanism of how to put more stress on your ACL. So if you're a predisposed athlete that's jumping and landing and you see someone who's doing a loaded box jump or a depth jump, and they have this raging valgus where they jump up and down, you'd probably want to correct that because, again, we have a pretty good substantial amount of evidence that that's a risk factor. Not that you're going to tear your ACL or something's going to go wrong. That's one of them. But also the other one that comes up a lot too is moving flexion in a spine during a deadlift, for example. I think we have some decent evidence that undergoing flexion of your spine while you're moving through a high load is predisposing you to more flexion intolerant back pain. So it's just, there's a good chunk of evidence that those things are a little concerning. So in my mind, if someone is, learning how to deadlift for the first time, we wouldn't want to maybe see them doing a very aggressively flexing of the spine during that movement. And so maybe as a coach, you would support that. So that's one. The other time I can think about from more of a sport specific and a coaching point of view is when it's very much a sport specific adaptation. So you're trying to learn how to throw or run or do gymnastics or something like that. And from a coaching point of view, it's a technical advantage to change the way you're moving, even if there's no pain, involved with that. So maybe as a really experienced baseball coach, you guys would know, as you watch someone throw, if there's something when you watch someone throw, you're like, ooh, we want to be careful of that because X, Y, and Z of stress on the elbow. So I can know a lot of examples in gymnastics where I would watch somebody do something. I'm like, we'd want to change maybe the way you land, the way you do something in a skill, because it's, again, an elevated risk of either soreness or we know performance-wise it's maybe not optimal.
I think on the flip side, to what Dave's point is an elevated risk, but I think we also know there's a decrease in injury rates when you have programs that are there to guide your landing and getting out of valgus, right? So we look at some of Tim Hewitt's stuff and his recent meta-analysis of a meta-analysis, which is funny because I'm waiting for the meta-analysis, but showed a 67% reduction in ACL injuries with working on neuromuscular control and getting out of valgus. So yeah, we can say it's okay to get into valgus and all that, but we also know getting out of valgus has a ton of research that says it protects you from tearing your ACL. That's why all these PEP programs and all these neuromuscular control programs are out there to decrease ACL rates, particularly in women. So I would say let's get out of the valgus and the extreme valgus position and trying to train people to have tissue, compensations in valgus, because I think we're going down a road that we don't want to go down, because we know the inverse of that is protecting.
Dan, what do you think? I saw you're trying to get the attention.
I know. I feel like there's like a million ways we can go right now with this one right here.
Just like movements, there's a million ways you can go. Just go with the best one.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I find myself talking to students frequently, and I work with a lot of weightlifters, right? So I think a little bit of valgus from a weightlifting perspective is very different from valgus, it's playing like soccer where you're having tremendous loads in valgus. It's a little bit different. One of the things that I often tell some of the students I'm working with is I'm working with, let's say, a very high level power lifter. If I start altering their technique, because I think it's a little bit off, kind of run that risk of making them a little bit worse, right? Just because they've developed this pattern over years and years and years, and maybe they are a little bit better adapted to that movement than someone else, right? But if I have a novice and I think, they're in a position that may increase stress to a given area, let's say they're having a lot of valgus when they lift, and they're at a point in their career where I can make that change, maybe make them a little bit more optimal from a lifting perspective, and potentially reduce that risk down the road, why wouldn't you? You know what I mean? And then if I have someone who has, let's say, chronic flexion-based low back pain, because a lot of folks will say, hey, you should be able to adapt to a flexed spine from a lifting perspective over the course of time, but you'll see folks that they just keep having these frequent flare-ups over the course of years. I'm probably going to change that person's technique to see if they can be more successful over the course of time and have less frequent flare-ups with a more neutral spine. So people always make this argument of you can adapt. Well, if someone's not adapting, maybe we make that change so they can have more success over time.
I like that. Really, really well said.
I think it also comes down to the forces through the knee too, right? When you have a valgus force with your in a deceleration type movement where you're running, cutting, your trunk is going in one direction, knees going in another direction. That's different than doing a squat with slight valgus. So I think we're trying to put them as the same concept on social media, but they just don't, you can't. Right. It's like comparing apples and oranges. You know what I mean? And that's why the forces through the ACL, you get a tearing in a soccer, volleyball type valgus versus, maybe somebody is torn their ACL doing weightlifting. It's probably more patella tendon, quad tendon, disc rupture or something like that. That's going to be your most common thing. But, yeah.
Isn't every movement pain-free until it isn't?
Exactly. Right.
Right. Like, not to, not to go too deep into that one, but right. Like,
I tore my ACL in the last run of the day. Of course it was the last run of your day.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's just, you always find your car keys in the last place you look, right? It's just absolutely. It's an interesting way to think about it, but I like the way that you guys so far have laid it out. Like that's a good way of thinking of it, is if we obviously know that there are significant risk factors that increase because of a movement, great. If you've had recurring issues with poor patterns, great. That makes sense. But, to me, I think sometimes these dramas get a little carried away online. But the reason why I like answering these questions here is because I'm telling you, the students, the early career professionals, they are confused as heck because they see these arguments and they have no context and they don't understand these little like concepts that we're talking about here. So what else, Kevin? Did you have some?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I thought Dan kind of nailed it, and Dave alluded to this too. But one of the times that I'll really consider changing it, if it's not something that they've had chronic problems with in the past, is just considering their training age. So, kind of like Dan said, if they're a novice weightlifter and they're displaying like some crazy patterns, like they'll squat and their heel comes way up off the ground, which you see pretty frequently, or they kind of dive into a valgus. That's something I'll try to cue and correct. And I wonder what Duesh's thoughts are on this, but I do feel like some of the best athletes we have a wide range of movement patterns that they can access at any time. So, if they have one pattern and that's just their only pattern they can access, and it's, say it's something like a knee valgus, well, we might want to change that just to give them other options. And maybe those will carry over to on the field, like Lenny was talking about. But it seems like to increase athletic performance, they should be able to move in various ways as well.
Dewey, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think everyone's point so far has been on the money. Like I think we definitely have to respect the valgus forces, like Lenny said, in sport, and like the high velocity, high force type situations. That's probably going to cause a higher rate of injury. While at the same time, like the perspective that I want to look at it from is almost developing a better eye as coaches and PTs to be able to see what is valgus and maybe what some other movement patterns that maybe looks like valgus, right? Like one memory that I have vividly is working with one of my basketball guys. He's someone that is extremely bouncy, like jumps out of the building, but has really good control of his body. But he's also someone that's got a ton of internal rotation, knows really well, just innately, how to like collapse the arch of his foot to kind of get into a good eccentric loaded position, and then kind of rebounds out of that by supinating and then, ERing his hips a little bit more. So like early on, I remember thinking like, all right, I got to fix this kid squat, because every time he gets out of the bottom, all right, like just out of the bottom position, foot's a little collapsed and knees a little in, but then he kind of comes right out and he's really powerful out of that position. Well, over the course of time, I realized that I could cue him as much as I wanted, but that's just a position that he, creates his power from, because he's just using his ability to eccentrically load, collapse the arch of his foot, IR his hips a little bit, and then reverse that completely on the concentric to get up out of it, right? And I started realizing this because as he's jumping, he does the exact same thing. So it wasn't true valgus that I was looking at initially, right? It was just his ability to actually control pronation and internal rotation of his hips that's actually helping him kind of load eccentrically and then be a little bit more powerful. So I think one thing that we got to be a little bit better at is like really assessing what's true valgus, especially in movements that we know are more controlled, right? Like squat.
I like that. And, I think the only thing I'd add that kind of, teams up on some of the things you guys have said here is that, there's a spectrum of acceptable movements, right? And I think sometimes, we've all made that mistake in the past, like, say like a sport mechanic type thing. There isn't one way to swing a bat or a golf club or throw a ball, right? There's multiple ways. I think as clinicians, we should understand maybe the ends of that spectrum that may be potentially detrimental either for performance or for injury risk. I think we have to understand that. I don't think we have to make it a fearful thing. And I think that's what sometimes people on social media are worried about, right? Like, I don't think we're going to tell anybody that their knees are going to explode on it. But I think if we say that, if we tweak this a little bit, we might be able to, decrease the stress on your body and enhance your force output. And I think that's a win-win for most people. So, I would just say there's probably an acceptable range of motion within pain-free movements, right? And I think it's our careful eye that you'll develop with a little experience that is going to tell you when somebody may be kind of getting to the ends of that spectrum, if that makes sense. So, good question, Kevin. Hopefully that helped. If you have a question like that, head to MikeReinold.com, click on that podcast link, and be sure to head to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcast, rate, review, please subscribe, and we will see you on the next episode.